Well, good morning and welcome. Bring greetings to you from the church at Lake Butler, Florida. We call it Santa Fe Mennonite Church there. And we love visitors too. So y'all are welcome to come visit sometime. I don't know very many of you here. I would know, of course, Glenn and Lindy. Glenn would be my wife's brother. And I would know David's family. But beyond that, I don't really know anyone. But we don't have to know you all to share God's word this morning. It's a privilege that we have to share God's word. This morning, if you would, turn to 1 Kings 18. And I've titled the message this morning, What's in Your House? What is in your house? And I'm not sure how to break in exactly, but have you ever felt that you've done a good deed and you got punished for it? Do you ever feel that way? Do you ever feel like you bend over backwards to help somebody and circumstances just fell down on top of you and you were crushed underneath all the aftermath of that? In 1 Kings 18, we have a man named Obadiah. Now, Obadiah was a godly man working in had an ungodly work environment. His work environment wasn't real good. But Obadiah, we're going to break in here in 1 Kings 18, verse 3. And Ahab called Obadiah, which was the governor of his house. He was like the business manager for Ahab's estate. He was Ahab's go-to man. If Ahab needed hay for his horses, he called Obadiah. And Obadiah would do it. If Ahab needed grocery money, Obadiah would take care of it. Obadiah was Ahab's man. He was the governor of his house. Now, in parentheses, it says, Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, even though Ahab didn't. Obadiah did. For it was so, when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, that Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50 in a cave, and fed them with bread and water. All right? So Obadiah was a godly man, and Jezebel was this wicked woman that was married to Ahab, and Ahab, I don't know what possessed Ahab to marry her in the first place, but Jezebel decided that it's time for a reform. So she said, your worship is just backwards. We're going to update this. So she brought in all her new priests and killed the old ones off. But Obadiah rescued 100 of them. Okay? That's the end of the parentheses. Now, back to here, it says, And Ahab said to Obadiah, Go into the land unto all fountains of water and unto all brooks. But remember, this is at the end of right close to the end of their drought. They had a 3.5-year drought, and things were getting really skinny, really dry, and really bad. So they're out looking for water. Now, normally Ahab would just send Obadiah out to do this, but Ahab was pretty desperate, so he's out there looking for it himself, too. Go into all brooks. Peradventure, or maybe, we might find grass to save the horses and mules alive, that we lose not all the beasts. Things were bad. So they divided the territory. Ahab went one way and Obadiah went the other way. And they went on looking, each one took the territory and looked at it himself. Verse 7, As Obadiah was in the way, he was going about his business, driving around. All of a sudden, Elijah was right there. Elijah met him, and Obadiah knew him, and fell on his face and said, Art thou that, my lord Elijah? So Obadiah went to meet Ahab. This is verse 16. They had a little conversation there, and Elijah told him to go get him and all that. And they had their meeting. Now, this was Elijah. Now, let's go on over to 2 Kings 4. And I might be jumping ahead a little bit. Adam Clarke's commentary gave this thought too. Some of the older what do you call it? The Hebrew writings would indicate that the story of the widow's oil and Obadiah's feeding of these 100 people was the same person. Now, Obadiah was a governor. He was the business manager for Ahab, but he was an honest man, and he wouldn't take the money. So he made a personal loan to feed these people. He fed all these 100 prophets. I don't know how long he fed the prophets, but he fed them, and whoever, anyway, it was expensive. But if you jump ahead a few years, we're going to read 2 Kings 4, verse 1. And you notice some of the details here. Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, different prophet, it's a few years later, saying, Thy servant my husband is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord. And the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. So if it was Obadiah, he took this loan, but he wasn't able to pay it back before he died. So the prophet here died and left his widow with a big bill. Left him with a big bill. So big they didn't have anything to pay it with. So then they're going to come get the boys to be slaves. And Elisha said unto her, What shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou in the house? What do you have in the house? He said, You've got a problem, but what do you have in the house? She said, Thine handmaid hath not anything in the house except 1 pot of oil. Then he said, Go, borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels. Borrow not a few. Get a bunch of them. Make it big. And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and shalt pour out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So she went from him, and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, Bring me yet a vessel. He said unto her, There's no more vessels. And and the oil stayed. That means there was no more oil to pour out. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go, sell the oil, and pay your debt, and live thou and thy children of the rest. You know, life has a way of bringing us to our knees. If you haven't faced it, you probably will face it. But probably all of you have faced a form of being in a dire strait. It might be a relative. I mean, there's probably worse things that will happen to you in life, and maybe not. But all of us will be up against it at some point where we don't have the answers. There's times we just can't go any further because circumstances bring us up short. You know, the widow in this account is a good example of being in a jam. Her husband had left her with a bill, with a debt that was too big to pay. She did have a house, and she had 2 sons. She had 1 bottle of oil. Beyond that, everything was gone. There was nothing else. And the man was coming to get, the creditor, it was probably a man, was coming to get her sons to pay the debt. Life was against her on all sides. Her husband was dead. She had a crushing mortgage. There was no money to pay. Her only sons were the security for the debt. And then she would be a widow with no means of support. Her sons were her future support. Her house was bare. There was no groceries. There was no furniture to sell. Nothing. And the deadline was here when the creditor would come. She was in a desperate time. You know, as a widow, she was vulnerable. As a mother, she was frantic. And as a debtor, she was powerless. As far as she knew, this was the end. So in desperation, she cries out to Elisha for help. She knew that her husband was a man of God. And Elisha was her only connection to her husband's helpful connection that she could think of. So she calls on Elisha, and she introduces their predicament by calling to his memory her husband's service. Don't you remember? My husband did this and this and this and this. And then she says, but now we've got a problem. And she says, the creditor's coming. We have the 2 boys, but the creditor's coming, and he'll be here by Friday evening, and he's going to take the boys unless I can find something to pay him with, and I have nothing. One thing about Elisha that's interesting is that he was a people's prophet. If you study the life of Elisha, he was a people's prophet. Elijah was more of a loner, but Elisha was with the people. He was available. He spent his time with the people. He would go to battles with the people. He just lived with them. He was available. And God used both of them, but it's interesting the difference in their personalities there. And Elisha was available. He heard the widow's story, and his interesting response was this. Or his response is interesting. He could have said, yes, God bless you for your faithful service, for your faithful support of your husband. The creditor is now dead. Go home, and the loan is forgotten. He could have said that. You can live happily ever after. But he didn't say that. He could have said, the money will be on your kitchen counter as soon as you step inside the door. But he didn't say that. Instead, he asked, what do you have in the house? She just got done telling him that she doesn't have anything. But he says, what do you have in the house? What do you have in your house? What do you have in your house when you face a difficult circumstance? How do we do when we cry out to God for help? God, I've got a problem. I don't have anywhere to go, nowhere to turn. Do we just throw up our hands and wait for God to send the money, or to clear the roadblock, or to fix the problem, while we eat an ice cream cone and wait for this to happen? Or whatever. Do we just sit down on a chair and wait for God to clear everything out for us so we can keep going? And God can do that, and He has done that sometimes. But God knows our makeup better than we do. God knows you. God knows how you operate, how you think. God knows that you have a sense of God doesn't want you to be lazy. We can say that. He knows our tendency to pity ourselves. He knows our needs better than we do. Sometimes He tests us to see if we're truly willing to do anything in our power to remedy a situation, or if we're just lazy and want Him to do all the work. I don't know. I'm kind of lazy sometimes. And it's much easier if God would just push the roadblocks out of the way so we can keep going. But God tests us to see if we're willing to expend some effort, if he provides an opportunity. So Elisha said, "What do you have in your house?" And she says, the cupboards are bare, there's no furniture. All the animals are gone. Well, she said, "Actually, I have one pot of oil, just a little pot of oil." probably, I'm going to say it's about this big. Just a little, she has a little bit of oil. Are we able to recognize what God has given us? You know, we might be destitute. We might not have any money. We might not have anything to actually do. But we can give a kind word, a smile. We can be an encouragement. We can we can do something for somebody else, an act of service. Maybe maybe God is asking us to forgive, and we aren't sure that we can do it. We don't have it in ourselves to forgive. But we can ask God to make us willing to forgive. A yielded heart broken before God, that's a will thing. That's something that we ourselves, with the free will God has given us, have to do. God can help us. He can bring circumstances in our life, but with the free will that God has given us, it's something we have to do, to surrender, to be broken. A willingness to surrender the outcome of our situation to God is also maybe something that we have in our house. But the widow, had a pot of oil in her house. That's all she had, was a pot of oil and her 2 sons. Her instructions were, go borrow vessels from all your neighbors, even empty vessels. Get all the empty vessels you can get. Don't be sparing on it. Get a bunch of them. Get little ones, big ones. Get 55-gallon barrels, get 5-gallon buckets, 13-quart bowls, water pitchers, glasses, anything you can get. Just go get it. Now, the widow was probably known as the widow, the poor widow that lives down the road. So what would you as the neighbor think when she comes knocking on your door? Could I borrow? I need some pots and pans and kettles and cups, anything you can spare. I need everything you can get. She was potentially making a fool of herself. For what? She didn't know what it was going to do. Her instructions was to get empty containers. Just get a bunch of them. Go make a fool of yourself. She could have thought that the neighbors would never loan their containers. Not to a poor widow who's about to lose her house or lose her sons. I mean, the neighbors might think that the creditors, that I'm going to go sell the containers so that I don't have to lose my sons. Whatever. Make a fool of herself. But there was action required on her part. Her instructions, she didn't know what the outcome was. And her instructions were to go get the vessels. There was action required in this. Did it take faith or obedience? Which one came first for her? Well, it took probably faith, because she had to at least believe that Elisha was his instructions were legitimate. But if all she did was believe that the instructions were legitimate and went home and sat down waiting for God to do it, it wouldn't have happened. It took some obedience. It took some action on her part to fulfill these instructions. You know, if you believe something, then you act on it. If you don't act on it, you don't believe it. That's just a fact of life. It just works that way. But they work together. It takes faith to obey, and obedience makes faith. Faith is rewarded according to obedience. Read it in the scriptures, it's often that way. Do you think the blind man would be the nobleman that came to Jesus, when he said, "Go home, thy faith has made your son well"? Do you think if he would have just hung around there and asked Jesus to give him some more confirmation that his son would be well? I don't know, but I don't think so, because it would show a lack of faith. But Jesus said, "Go home," so he went home, and there was his son. Back to the widow here was given an opportunity that took effort on her part. The attention to detail was important too. Elisha said, get a lot of vessels. If she would have been skeptical and just gone to one neighbor and got 2 water pitchers, that's all she would have gotten, just 2 pitchers of oil. But no, her faith was rewarded according to her obedience. So she got as much oil as she got vessels. The amount of vessels that she borrowed directly impacted the amount of oil she could sell. That's just what I said. It took the act of obedience in borrowing the vessels first before she could realize what would happen. Now she got the vessels. She did that part. And then she goes back and says, okay, we got all these vessels here. The house is full. There's no room for any more. What do I do now? Elisha says, shut the door and pour. Shut the door. Shut the door. You know, God asks us to shut the door sometimes. Do you know that? Sometimes our mind goes into overdrive. And we try to think of all the scenarios that could happen to us, that we lose our focus on on even the simple things at hand. But shut the door. We block out some of these distractions and focus on the task at hand. And sometimes the task at hand is simply falling on our knees before God and crying out to Him. And that's all. There's a time for that. And we need to do that every day. Sometimes we fail to shut the door and spend quality time with God, and we starve ourselves. Sometimes the problems that we face are self-inflicted because we're starved. But shut the door. And I don't know all your situations. I'm sure that there's things that you're facing right now that you could benefit from a pot of oil pouring and selling. Or I'm sure there's distractions in your life too. You're normal people. But the instructions to the widow was to shut the door. Block out the distractions. Keep the neighbors out. Pull the window blinds down. And then pour. Take the oil, that little pot that you have, and start here. So the creditor won't bother you inside the house. Don't worry about tomorrow. Just shut the door and pour. You know, there's a time to close the door of worry. We're probably all prone to it, especially if we know that certain actions that we have done could create some reactions. And we can worry about how all that will play out. We do. It's somehow in our makeup. But we are not to let that worry consume us. And there's a time to shut that off. Shut the door and pour. Pour what went through the widow's mind when she took her little flask and started pouring. I just imagine that she started pouring in the smallest one she could get. I don't know what the littlest container was, but she started pouring into there, and it filled up. She looked in there. She looked, it's still full. So she goes to the next one and pours in, and it fills up. And then the next one, and she starts getting excited. You know, this is interesting, so she pours more. Finally, she gets to the big one, the big 55-gallon barrel, and she pours and pours and pours and pours and pours and pours. Pretty soon it fills up. And she goes to the next one. And she's having a good time doing this, actually. And then she says, bring more. Tell the boys to bring more. And they said, well, they're all here. We don't have any more. Oh, okay. Well, her little flask was still full, but or same level that it was, but there was no more. That was it. When she shut the door and started pouring, she wasn't thinking about her problems. All of a sudden, she was thinking about what's happening here. This is a miracle. It's a miracle. There is a time for us to stop dwelling on our problems and exercise what we have in our house. To just pour the oil. But now that she's got the oil, she doesn't have room to walk around. So she gets out the door somehow. Maybe she crawled out the window. I don't know. But there was so much oil around. So she goes back to Elisha and she says, "What do I do now, Elisha? I've got so much oil in the house that I can't move." And Elisha says, "Well, now go sell the oil and pay the debt." Okay. So I don't know how she did that, but there's a lot of oil. She went and sold the oil and had some money. Go sell the oil and pay the debt. Can you imagine? Here comes the creditor walking up the road or up the driveway. Gonna come. He's kind of looking forward to taking these boys, at least in my imagination. And as he comes in there, he kind of brought up short. Where in the world did you get this money? But there it was. So she was able to keep her boys, and she had money left over. Go sell the oil and pay the debt. God has a way of providing opportunities to deliver us from situations that seem to grip us tightly. He does. It takes effort on our part to find and work out those opportunities. Many times God reveals just a little bit, maybe an opportunity here or an opportunity there, and things they work out. Things tend to work out. Live of the rest was part of the instruction. Sell what you have, sell the oil and pay the debt and live of the rest. After that initial need was met, God worked this out abundantly that she had money to live on. I don't know if there was enough for her to live the rest of her life, but it carried her through the immediate need. It at least carried her through till her boys were old enough to be able to work. God met her need. And I kind of like the thought of Obadiah being, I think they're connected. Personally, I think they're connected. But Obadiah did a good deed. He rescued the Lord's prophets in a terrible time. If it was Obadiah, he borrowed this money because he was an honest man. He could have, with his position, sneaked it out of Ahab's grocery money. But he didn't. He did a personal loan, or borrowed the money. This prophet had borrowed the money somewhere, borrowed money and died a creditor. And he was a godly man. He was a prophet and a godly man. And yet it caused a problem for his family. His righteous act, his selfless act, did not ensure that he lived happily ever after. But it did ensure that God had an opportunity to meet their needs in a miraculous way. Many times when God does that in our life, when we feel like we're at the end of the road, but somehow God makes a path through it, and we walk through the path, and we look back later, and we wonder, why did we ever doubt in the first place? Have you ever faced that? Why did we ever doubt God was right there. But when we're in the middle of it, it's hard for us to understand. We just feel like it's black. The walls are closing in. But after we go through and we see how God works, our faith is strengthened. And our faith is also strengthened as we look back and remember those times. The history of how God worked helps us in our current situations and maybe in future times when we face similar experiences. You know, today we have many opportunities to let God use the things we have in our house for His glory. And are we willing to let Him? You know, maybe we don't feel like we have much, but that song this morning, I think it was number 660. It's just I love that song. I didn't even know it was in these books until we got here this morning. But it gives the thought of God's Spirit pouring out into our hearts. And that's another aspect of it too. The vessels, we're empty vessels before God. It says, "Are you longing for the fullness of the blessing of the Lord in your heart and life today? Claim the promise of your Father. Come according to His word in the blessed old-time way. Bring your empty earthen vessels, clean through Jesus' precious blood. Come, ye needy, one and all, and in humble consecration wait before the throne of God till the Holy Ghost shall fall. Like the cruse of oil, unfailing is His grace forevermore, and His love unchanging still. And according to His promise with the Holy Ghost and power, He will every vessel fill. He will fill your heart today to overflowing, as the Lord commandeth you, whatever situation you're in. Bring your vessels, not a few. Don't be skimpy on them. He will fill your heart today to overflowing with the Holy Ghost and power." I'd like to leave that challenge with us this morning. When I was young, we had a little bit of this happen to us. This was in our family before I was married. But my dad was did construction work, and there was a time, and it was going well. It really was. But for whatever reason, we don't know why, still don't know why to this day, the phone quit ringing, and things got tight. I mean, really, really tight. Dad borrowed money and borrowed money and borrowed money to keep things going until it was about, he just wasn't able to keep going. And I remember, I was probably 17 at the time, 16, 17, something like that. And it was stressful. Mom would go to town, there wasn't grocery money, there just wasn't. And it wasn't like the creditor was going to come get us. It's not even that, looking back, it's probably not even that big of a thing, but it seemed like a big deal to us. And we would pray, and we would pray and pray, and just nothing seemed to come out. Nothing happened. And I don't know. I think I was 16. I started mowing yards just on the side on Saturdays. And that provided some grocery money, but things were really tight. I went to work for my uncle for a while, for about a year. And it just never really turned around for us. It never did on that. And there was probably about 2 years we were in limbo, just nothing, didn't really understand what God was trying to do or say or whatever. And finally, I don't know why, in the middle of the night, Dad was working for my uncle as well. We were doing plumbing work, which was not something we were really used to doing. But we worked there. I worked there probably for a year and a half, and Dad was maybe 6 months or something, I'm not sure. But in the middle of the night, one night, Mom had a dream to do a different occupation. And it wasn't something that we really thought would work, but it actually did work. And God has blessed. He is really blessed in that more than it would have if we would have never gone through that. And God will do. It doesn't always materially bless, but sometimes the spiritual blessings outweigh, the spiritual blessings that we get from going through a difficult time are like the oil that is poured into these vessels. So I guess I would leave a challenge to you all. If you're going through a difficult time, just fall on your knees before the Lord and do follow up on the opportunities that he sends your way. I'll turn the time over to whoever.